Hi, everybody. This is Iris, and I'm checking in from Mexico. Today, we have an amazing interview with an old friend of mine, Adrian Chavanna. Hi, Adrian.
Hi, Edith. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to chat with you today. Adrian is checking in from Minnesota. Is that correct?
Yeah, I am. I'm here in St. Cloud, Minnesota, which is about an hour west of Minneapolis, St. Paul. So, yeah, I'd like to acknowledge, that I'm sitting here on the um, ancestral, traditional, and contemporary homelands of the Dakota and Ojibwe people, um, many who have become my close friends and colleagues since I've been here for about 6 years, doing my graduate studies at the University of Minnesota. And in fact, Minnesota itself is a Dakota word. It's actually a phrase, Minnesota Makoche, which means land where the water is so clear it reflects the sky. So a lot of people don't realize, but most of the 50 states in the US come from the native people, either their language or something dealing with their geography or their culture, like Tejas, right? It's like a cattle word, right? That means friend. So yeah, I'm excited to talk through sort of the things that we talked about in the pre-interview discussion. And it's been a long time coming. Like you said, we go back a long time, back to our Mecha days at the university. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, wow, it has been a long time. I think we've both been on quite a journey because we met in Mecha
Yeah,
and it crossed over. So yeah, it's been a long journey. We met in Mecha, but a lot happened over this past, what, 15, 20 years,
yeah,
from stepping into the radical world of, I don't know, chicanismo, I guess you could say, which is like a pathway to where we are now. I mean, we've been through ceremony. There's been so many layers to this. So I guess we'll just take it from the top. So
yeah.
really quickly, I'd love to read your bio. So Adrian is a PhD candidate at the Department of History, the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. He's a native of Houston, Texas, and he specializes in American Indian and Chicana history. His work on tribal resurgence in Texas puts American Indian history, Chicano history, and U.S.-Mexico borderlands history into a direct dialogue. His dissertation, Reclaiming Tribal Identity in the Land of the Spirit Waters, the Tapilam Coahuiltecan Nation, is a case study of the modern-day descendants of the 18th century mission Indians of San Antonio, who are in the midst of a tribal resurgence and actively pushing back against narratives of Coahuiltecan extinction. Adrian employs indigenous research methodologies, including centering indigenous ways of knowledge and being of service to the indigenous communities that inform his work, along with traditional historical methods of archival research. Adrian, I'd like to ask you a few questions. I know that you'll be defending your dissertation this December and officially completing your PhD. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey, your cultural heritage, how you got to this point?
Yeah, so I'll start sort of with the immediate grad school and how I got to Minnesota, and then I'll sort of take it back to my childhood. So yeah, so about 6 years ago, so I was teaching middle school in the barrios of North Houston, where I'm from. I'm originally from Houston, Texas, and I taught sixth, seventh, and eighth grade, which is like Texas history, world history, and U.S. history, and I did that for about 8 years. And as things are going from bad to worse in terms of what teachers can teach, right? And like for those of you that don't know, for example, the state of Texas just passed a law outlawing critical race theory in K-12, which in reality most K-12 teachers don't teach critical race theory. But that's another way of sort of skirting around the issue of actually teaching the truth, or just what really happened in history, right? Really basic historical facts that um, that are a challenge to really to the white supremacist structures that inform those kinds of decisions. So after about 8 years of teaching middle school history, I decided that I really love history. I really love teaching history. And what I really wanted to do was original historical research, and write um, and teach at the university level. So I got my application in order, which we can talk about that later, sort of demystifying the application process for graduate school, because it's way different than applying to undergraduate program. And then I got accepted, and I prayed about it. I had a ceremony for that, um, for my journey. That would be my journey for the next several years here in Minnesota. So at that going away ceremony, I had so many relatives show up inside of that teepee. Was uh, triple road, and if you can believe it, 3 rows inside of that teepee, and that's how much love and support and community was behind me to send me away. And I told them that I would be going up north to do this work, and that I would be bringing all of them with me. That's what we do. We leave the ladder down, and then we bring our relatives with us. And so this mezcal bean necklace was actually given to me at that going away ceremony, and it's sort of been one of my protectors since I've been up here doing the work that I do. And so, yeah, that's sort of the immediate of how did I get to Minnesota. You know, but going back, like as I said, I'm from Houston. But my parents are from the Rio Grande Valley. So my mom is from Laredo, which I guess technically is not the valley. They get upset if we say that. And my dad was born in Corpus Christi, but his parents are from McAllen, which is on the one of the border towns like Laredo. And so I would grow up going to Laredo and to McAllen to visit my grandparents as a little kid for, the holidays. And, that Tejano identity was something that was instilled in me at a very early age. My dad, would jam like, Roberto Pulido and Little Joe, and, Saturday mornings just blasting Tejano music as we clean the house. And then my grandma, um, on my father's side, so my paternal grandmother, Herminia Bailly de Chavana. So she, ever since I can remember, she would always tell me about these land grants and land grants and the land grants. And I was like 6 or 7, and I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? I had no idea. And she would tell me, you know, this side of the family, they come from nobility. They're Spanish nobility. They were nobles, and they had land grants. And I was just like, yeah, okay, whatever. And so, well, it turns out that the Bailly family is one of the 5 largest Spanish land grant families in South Texas, right? In fact, when I would teach Texas history, my family was in there by name as sort of one of the first Tejano families. But as I started growing up, obviously I don't look like a Spaniard, right? So I knew there was like another half of the equation that was missing. And I knew we were ethnically Mexican and ethnically Tejano. But I always wondered, well, what does that mean? What is the complete story here? And I remember actually taking Texas history when I was in 7th grade. And I remember the teacher's name was Mrs. Perry. And she would talk about the way she pronounced it, the Coahuiltecan Indians and the Coahuiltecan Indians. And there was a sort of this real, one of those pictures of the guy in the loincloth with the spear. And the narrative was that they were extinct. And they, and I remember thinking, well, what do you mean they're extinct? Like, where did they go? What happened to them? And so that actually just stuck in my brain, as I went through my formative years and thinking about that all the time. And so by the time I got to high school, I started to get more radical, involved in, local politics. I remember one of the first marches that I went to was a march against police brutality, where they had killed HPD had served this warrant. They went into this house, and they probably had the wrong house, if I remember, and they ended up like emptying like multiple clips into this guy. Um, and I was like 14, 15 years old, marching for justice for this man that had been wrongly killed at the hands of HPD. And that really sort of set my path of radicalization. And then I go, turns out my brother was going through our garage one day, and he found this box of newspaper clippings and buttons. And they were newspaper clippings of my father when he ran for city council under La Raza Unida in San Marcos. And so, my parents were involved with the Raza Unida party. They never talked to us about it. They never spoke to us about it. So that activism and that radicalism was already in our DNA. That's just how it came to be. So, by the time I got to the university, then, my brother was in Mecha. So I joined Mecha, and then got involved with, immigrant rights struggles, the police brutality, but also reaching out to high school students. We would have these, we called them the Rasa Youth Conferences, and we would bring them in. I remember a couple of years we had a captive audience. We were working with a charter school, and they were like, make these kids just sit in detention for the whole Saturday doing nothing. We're like, why don't you just let us come in, and then we'll have a whole workshop, a whole day of workshops for these students. So we did that for several years, and we provided information about how to apply to college, financial aid and scholarships, and then of course the cultural aspects of La Danza Azteca, right? Aztec dance, and how the basics on how to read the calendar, and history and culture and that sort of thing. And then so it was through those through those types of activities that I started to meet people around Texas that would participate in sweat lodge ceremonies, the temazcales. Um, they were involved in La Danza Azteca, and then eventually people involved with the Native American Church. One person in particular, an elder by the name of Conrado Acevedo, he would start taking me around to all these meetings, Native American church meetings, all over Texas, really. A lot were in San Antonio. And so I just started expanding. I was at that time in my early 20s, and sort of expanding my network of people involved in this red road. But I would look around and I would see, something. This is something distinct, something very rooted in a deep history that that nobody's written about, that nobody's studied, right? And so, as a practitioner of those red road ways, actually met Carla Aguilar along the way. And actually, she just recently told me this story a few years ago when I was back in San Antonio doing my dissertation research. But that it was at one of those after one of those encuentros for the high school youth, that we had a sweat lodge, and then I invited her because she was a speaker at the Rasa Youth Conference. And so that was the first time she went to a sweat lodge, and from there she sort of started finding her own way on the red road. And then so as I get into graduate school and I start thinking about my project, I knew I wanted to do something with the indigenous people of Texas, the Tejano people, the Coahuiltecan people, the medicine, the red road, the peyote way. And as I'm formulating these ideas, which have really not been written about, at least in a scholarly way. I mean, there's been a history of a Native American church, but I think it sort of excludes Tejano people, right? And we've played a large role in the peyote trade, even as dealers. One of the first, actually the first federally licensed peyote dealer was a Tejana woman, right? And so Grandma Cardenas, as they call her. And but even before that, she was, her family was generations of her family was in the peyote trade, selling it as a medicine like that. So Carla's like, hey, I'm working with this tribal community here in San Antonio, and they're like lineal descendants of the San Antonio Mission Indians who built and lived in the San Antonio missions in the 18th 18th century. And she's like, would you like to meet them? I said, sure, I'd love to meet them. So like that, then she arranged a meeting, and I went to they had a nonprofit organization with a really nice office there, just on the west side of San Antonio. And I presented myself, I took some gifts for them, and I just explained who I was and what I was doing. And I would be really interested in working with them to sort of do a case study, a tribal history of the San Antonio Mission Indians and their modern day descendants. So that's how the project really came to be.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the struggle at the Alamo? I'm a San Antonio girl, so I have stories that my mother told me that our people are buried there, but very few of those details actually made it through all the layers of colonialism and colonization that generations of our people have gone through, right? So like that's one of the bits that I know, but then it stops there. So like, can you tell us a little bit more about the nation and why this struggle that they're going through, like with the Alamo or with this body of work, is so important, not just to San Antonians, but to Tejanos, to Native peoples from the Southwest in general?
So yeah, so my research has taken me to several traditional archives, right, including Our Lady of the Lake, Old Spanish Missions Archive, the Spanish Colonial Archive, which is curated by Bexar County, the Archdiocese of San Antonio, and the Tapilam Coahuiltecan Nation, the tribal community at the center of my study. They themselves have maintained quite the archive. And so it's my understanding that I'm the first person that they really opened up their archive, their tribal archive, and trusted me in that way to spread, but also at the same time protect, right, traditional knowledge. So it's a pretty big responsibility, right? And I don't take it lightly. So let me see if I can share this screen here. 1 second.
I'd also like to make a quick note for those that are just starting their journeys and are getting interested in their lineage and in going to dig for their roots. These archives that Adrian is mentioning, they're not all curated in one place. Like, it is a huge amount of work that he has gone through to pull together the tidbits of facts and names and dates and information. So I commend you, Adrian, because like I barely scratched the surface with my own family, and I like literally had to go to these little pueblos, to the First Catholic Church, to look at these records that are falling apart. So this is critical work. Thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Edis. In fact, going back to my grandmother who wrote that book about the Bai side of my family, she had, I think, an 8th grade education, but genealogy was her life's work. And she had the oral histories of her family as a starting point. So I would recommend to people who are, this is the big thing now, especially with so much technology at our fingertips, right? That are, colonialism, oh man, it did a number, right? It did what it was supposed to do. And so now we have these little fragments of history and oral history and identity and culture and foodways that we're trying to, piece back together. And a lot of times, I have one of my colleagues, he's a Genízaro scholar. So they're basically the mestizo people of New Mexico. And, he said in one of his books, we're both the slave and the slave owner. And so that's a heavy colonial legacy that we deal with as mostly mestizo people, right? Um, and so, yeah, you're right. It's been a lot of work. They're not all in one place. They're scattered. At one point, they were scattered literally all over the world, including the um, Archivo Nacional or Archivo de las Indias, something like that. The Archive of the Indies, which was located in Spain, right? So this is the imperial archive that these Spanish chroniclers, as they're writing about native people, they're sending it back to Spain and putting it into like the official imperial archive, and to as far south as like Guanajuato or down there, which was like the uh, legislative or the juridical home, I guess you can say. In other words, if there was, let's say, a trial in what's now South Texas, eventually it would in colonial South Texas, it would wind up, being heard in Guanajuato, because that's where like the juridical, I don't know what you call it, area, the court system that was in charge of colonial South Texas was somewhere down there. But yeah, and then can you see this screen? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, and one more note about archival work. The last thing that I was doing was I had 3 rolls of microfilm. I don't know if you remember old school microfilm shipped to me from San Antonio just a few months ago, and I happened to live across the street from a library. So I'm digitized. I spent the last several weeks digitizing 3 rolls of archival film, and I'll show some of those records in a minute, which span from like 1703 to 1860, right? So yeah, it's been quite the archival journey, but also, guided by oral histories and really good people and archivists along the way that have been really helpful too. So, I see we're already kind of 30 minutes into it. I want to be respectful of your time, so I'll try to get to some of the highlights here, right? What I found in my research. So here in the encircled area, you can see what is the traditional homeland of the Coahuiltecan people, right? And that river there that we now call the Rio Grande River, that was just another river, right? And so archaeologists tell us that they settled in that region about 11,000 years ago. And as a result, the multiple languages that were spoken in this region, their language, what they're called language isolates, right? What linguists call language isolates, which means they're not related to any of the other, I think it's 53 American Indian language families. They're like standalone languages that are not related to any of the other American Indian languages. And that's a result of being in one place for so long. So like other parts of the world where you see language isolates, that means that those particular people have just been there for a long time. And so this picture on the left, that was sort of the picture that I remember from my Texas history textbook when I was in 7th grade. And the narrative was, and what I'm pushing back against through my work, is that they simply went extinct, right? Like, but I think, so here's putting it in a bigger context, right? They weren't living in an isolated vacuum, right? And so just as we think about like nations with diplomats and diplomacy, so too were the Coahuiltecan people engaged in this diplomacy with their neighbors, the Carancua, the Tancua, later the Lipan Apache and the Comanche would come. And I think one of the important things to notice is on the right, as you see, is sort of a Texas history textbook map. And if you notice, the demarcation at the Rio Grande River, it just stops there. And then if you look at the Mexican, from a Mexican textbook on the left, the picture on the left, the same thing, look at the Rio Grande and the demarcation just stops there. So, you know, both, both countries, I think their national histories and their national stories, I think I'm complicating those national narratives by engaging in this sort of research and thinking about, you know, a transnational people that continue to be a transnational people and have always been a transnational people, right? And so that's kind of sort of putting it into a bigger perspective. Here's a map of all the Spanish missions that were established in Texas between 1632 and 1793. And then this one, sort of with the most central importance to the missions in San Antonio, this was established in 1702, just south of the Rio Grande River, Mission San Bernardo, what some historians have called the gateway to Spanish Texas. And so I think there was actually 3 missions at this complex. This is one of those 3 missions. It's still standing. As you can see, this is a modern day photograph of the actual structure. You know, one thing that I think scholars haven't really done too much of, and which I'm beginning to do in my work, is to put all of these colonial projects into a larger conversation, right? Because not only do you have the Spanish, right, but you have the Portuguese, you have the Dutch, you have the English. And, you know, we think about the reservation system and we think about like the Indian wars, right, of the Great Plains and the Lakota and the Dakota. But really what nobody has really written about or thought about, at least that I have seen, is if you think about it, the Spanish were like the first imperial force in what we now call the Americas. And the first thing that they did in those Caribbean islands was to round up the native people and basically put them on a reservation. Removal, Indian removal began in 1492, not in 1830. And so they called these basically, what was the term for them? The name escapes me. I'm sure it'll come. I'm sure it'll come back to me. But essentially, they were, I would argue, the first reservations, right, in what we call the Americas. And so these missions served reducciones. That's what they called them. So they called them reducciones. So like in places like the Caribbean and central Mexico, these reducciones were basically reservation towns where native people were removed to. They were not allowed to leave that particular town. And the missions in colonial Texas served the similar purpose, right? They were established to detribalize native people, to round them all up. And by detribalize, I mean, make them forget which particular Indian nation are they from, right? Because if you go back to that map of the Coahuiltecan territory, within that Coahuiltecan territory, there were hundreds of distinct Coahuiltecan bands, and each with their own language, each with their own cosmology, each with their own traditions. So they would put them in these missions, and a lot of them were not able to, even though they were all Coahuiltecan people, a lot of times they were not able to communicate with each other because of those language barriers. And so Coahuiltecan or Pacawa, and actually, as I've also learned, it's called Pacawa. Sometimes it's also called Tejano. That's one of the languages that became the sort of the lingua franca of the missions in Texas, so that they could communicate. And so as these missions were established under Spanish colonial law, they were established as semi-autonomous Indian pueblos. And so what does that mean? It means that that the Franciscan missionaries were sort of the legal trustees, but within the mission system, the native people had a form of self-government, like we see in modern day reservations, right? And so this is why I keep making those connections that nobody's really talked about. So at the there was the Pueblo Cabildo, which was the mission town council. So it was a council of the mission residents, and they would make they would sort of make communal decisions about the daily life. And then at the head was the gobernador, or the governor. And so the Spanish are grafting these titles, alcalde, gobernador, pueblo cabildo, mayor, and it created these dual parallel systems, which was called La República de los Indios and La República de los Españoles. And those two ways of life were not allowed to cross. But of course, right, history is messy, and they did. And so that's sort of, especially in the late mission era, where we begin to see, you know, a lot of intermarriage between the mission residents and then the Spanish soldiers, because they didn't bring their women folk with them a lot of the times. And so I'll just show this one here. Probably the most famous mission in San Antonio, without a doubt, is Mission San Antonio de Valero, more commonly known as the Alamo. It was established in 1718. And a lot of those folks that established the mission we were just looking at moved from there, so just south of the Rio Grande, with the Spanish missionaries to establish Valero. And then soon thereafter, 4 more missions were established, each one, again, being considered a semi-autonomous Indian pueblo under Spanish colonial law, each with its own gobernador and its pueblo cabildo. And of course, the goal is to detribalize again, and then convert them, right, to Catholicism.
I have a question. Sorry.
Yeah.
So this period that we're looking at is in the 1700s, but this is like what, 100, 150 years after contact, after we're part of the transatlantic slavery trade? Or
Yeah.
I guess because do you know roundabouts the date of first contact that it in the written record for Texas?
Yeah, that's a good question, and thank you for stopping me. That's good. Please stop me at any time, so that the viewers, you know, I'm sure if you have a question, they also have a question, right? So the first European contact in Texas was Cabeza de Vaca, and he was shipwrecked right off the coast of what's now Galveston, and most of his crew died. But him and a handful of survivors were able to survive, and they were only able to survive because they were nursed back to health by the Karankawa people, who nursed them, literally nursed them all back to health. They were, I mean, they were shipwrecked on Galveston. They were going to die. And so, you know, it's interesting because I've read some scholarship about that. Long story short, he wanders through South Texas for like 10 years. So he meets multiple bands of Karankawa and Coahuiltecan people, some of which are welcoming, some of which not so much, right? Understandably. Eventually, after 10 years of wandering around lost in South Texas, he makes it to some Spanish settlement. I think he was already way out there in New Mexico or something like that. Then eventually makes his way back to Mexico City, then back to Spain, and he writes his memoirs. So you can read those memoirs of Cabeza de Vaca, which is the first European contact in Texas, but that's early. That's in the 1500s or something, you know, 150 years before they would come back. And so, and if you read his chronicles, he says that he became a medicine man amongst the Karankawa. But what historians have argued is that that was sort of his interpretation of what was happening. And I think he was planting the seed, basically letting them know, we're going to come back, and we're going to come back with crosses, right? And we're going to, you know, so 150, basically Texas goes unsettled by the Spanish for the next 150 years or so. And then in 1690, sort of all of this that would become San Antonio starts drumming up again. And that's sort of how that happened, right? But that's a good point, because Texas was sort of like the last frontier of the Spanish borderlands in the north. And because of that, you know, the Indians and the missions were able to subvert a lot of the stuff that they were not able to subvert in central Mexico, for example, the peyote ceremony. In fact, I argue in my dissertation that it's because of the missions, not in spite of them, that the peyote ceremony was able to not only survive, but to spread to other Indians, in particular the Lipan Apache, who would also, a handful of them would come to live in the missions. And then from there, of course, it would take up, you know, further north, the Tonkawa and the Lipan Apache, and then eventually, you know, Quanah Parker, and then, but that's already taken us into the 20th century. But yeah, you know, they would go into and because of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in New Mexico, which was basically one of the first major, if not the first major Indian uprising in the Americas, they ran the Spanish out of town in New Mexico, and they kept them out for like 12 years. But that's because they were so excessive in stamping out in indigenous spiritual ways and indigenous identity, that the native people revolted. So when they got to Texas, you know, that was 1680 was the Pueblo Revolt. 1718, Valero was established. They said, we got to do something different. So it became sort of and this is, you can find this in the archive, in the archival record, it became the official policy to look the other way when the Mission Indians in San Antonio would go into the woods and have their peyote ceremonies. And so the padres realized, we got to give some sort of concession, or we're going to have another revolt like we did in New Mexico. And so that's one interesting thing of, you know, as much as this Catholicism is sort of being, you know, shoved down their throats, they still find these ways to resist and to maintain their native identity. And in fact, the mission becomes this mission. I argue in my dissertation that their new identity, because, you know, this thing about Indian identity, it's not static. It never has been static. We're always changing. We're always evolving. If not, we don't survive. We don't survive as a people. So that's sort of my argument about Coahuiltecan survivance, right? Is like, we still carry those seeds. We still have that DNA. We're still here. We didn't go anywhere. We speak a different language and we have different traditions and customs, but that's like half of our DNA, if not more. And so I'm getting carried away, but yeah, that's good. Let me see what the next slide is. I have no idea what it is, but we'll see. Oh, okay. So here's just something. If you go to the missions today, the lower 4 missions are curated. They're a part of the San Antonio Missions National Historical Park. And so each one of them has a small museum. And this just shows the daily life of the Mission Indians as they're becoming acculturated into Spanish society. The idea was once they would become Christian, they would get baptized, and they would get indoctrinated in the Catholic ways, and then they would become what the Spanish called gente de razón, right? So they're no longer indios bárbaros. Now they're people of reason, and so they're worthy subjects of the Spanish crown, and then they're able to leave the mission system and become regular subjects of the Spanish crown. So that was the ultimate goal of the mission system.
I'd like to interject here also. So in my own like personal research, I learned that once they were converted, they were given Christian names, often the surname of the padrecito that converted them. And so like Rodriguez, which is my last name, there's Rodriguez everywhere in San Antonio because there was a padrecito going around town, you know, converting people. And so I think there's also a lot of confusion about that, you know, some people who haven't done this work are like, oh, I'm Spanish. Oh, I'm Spanish. My last name is this, but there's reasons why we ended up there.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, that's what we're going to look at these three documents here, and we're going to see how indios were literally written out of existence. In fact, this is what scholars call a paper genocide. And so in in my dissertation, I do what we call a lineal descent study. And so basically, I started with a modern day descendant of the Tapilam and worked backwards, building on the incredible work that he had already done. But you know, as scholars, we have to verify this stuff. We can't just take it at face value. And so this was false. So this is the ancestors of one of these contemporary mission descendants. And the name of the couple escapes me. Forgive me. I'm already like working on my last chapter. This was the one I just wrote, and so I've kind of put it away for a minute until I get back to the revisions. But this is some of the archival, showing some of my archival work. So you have a couple here, a married couple, and basically they entered the mission system in, I want to say the 1770s. Okay, is where we first see them in the archival record. Let's see, Diaz. Okay, I can see it here. This is the Diaz family, and it's a married couple with several children. So in the 1793 census of, I believe this is San Juan, they're listed as indios. Okay, 1 year later, they're listed as, there's no casta listed. So it doesn't say indio, it doesn't say mestizo, it doesn't say español. But in 1796, the couple is listed as españoles. So between 1793 and 1796, through the written archival record, they're able to whiten up from indios to españoles. And so that they've become gente de razón. And then you know, again, this is sort of that paper genocide. And if we think about that again, you know, in more more U.S. terms, but to think about it in the Spanish colonial terms is I think something that nobody's really thought of. So I'd like, you know, I want to leave it. Let's see if I can read it. It says Manuel Díaz, Indio, Oficio, Labrador, Natural del Venado, casado con Gertrudis González, India, natural de esta vía. So it tells you, you know, not only does it have list them, but it gives all of this biographical data. And so we really begin to see who these people are, what professions are they working in, where were they born, how long have they been at the missions. And a lot of times with these old mission families, you see them, and that's just where they're from. Natural means born at. So you see natural de esta vía. So she was born in that mission, right? That's how long those families, generations. And I think this is sort of maybe not the typical experience, because most people would come and go, right? They would use the mission for food, for safety from the, you know, particularly from the Comanche and the Lipan Apache, and a place to just hang out for a while. And then they would bounce. They'd go back to their traditional ways of living and then come back in for a little bit. But this particular couple, I followed them across decades in the San Antonio missions. And I found that really interesting. Do you have any questions or any thoughts about this?
My mind is blown. I'm
Yeah.
My mind is blown. Wow. So
Yeah.
honestly, like they've been writing us out of the record multiple colonial, what is the terminology? Occupiers, settlers, multiple colonizers have tried to write us out.
Yeah.
This thing with Texas history and critical race theory, this is not new. We've been at this for generations at this point. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that going back to that piece that you said about, oh, well, I'm Spanish. This is why, right? Because that's what they were told. And so, in other words, the project worked, the colonial project worked the way that it was supposed to, right? So the Mexican War for Independence, 1810 through 1821. 1821 basically marks the end of the mission system in San Antonio. And so what ends up happening, actually going back to this is the later period. What ends up happening in this later period is that we see a larger mixture, intermarriage between the native people in the missions and then the Spanish soldiers and then just the regular town folk who started renting rooms in the missions at that time. And so the decision was made by the friars to secularize the missions. And what that means is that they would no longer be a mission, but they would be a regular diocese controlled by a local archdiocese. And the idea was like, okay, everybody's like Spanish now. We've done our job. We're closing up shop. And I mean, you're talking over the course of, let's see, between 1718 and 1823, at any given year, within those 5 missions, there was about 250 residents, Indian residents. So over that time, you're talking about thousands of indigenous people, not hundreds, but thousands of indigenous people that have gone through this missionization process. And so they leave the process, they're speaking Spanish, they're Catholic, at least outwardly Catholic. And then we see this uprising, right? Mexican independence, a revolt against the Spanish colonial order, and the final secularization of the San Antonio missions, in which they're basically incorporated as by the city of San Antonio, or what would become the city of San Antonio, and they become sort of these regular dioceses within the local archdiocese, all of them except San Antonio de Valero, right, which would sort of experience a different historical trajectory. After this time, 1821, more or less, it would no longer be used for religious services. It was occupied first by the Spanish colonial army, and then the Mexican army, and then the US Army, then the Confederate Army, then the US Army took it back after the Civil War. And then, of course, in between there is the Texas War for Independence and the Davy Crockett and all of those guys. But the lower 4 missions, here's sort of a, putting all of this into perspective, what's happening. There's a lot going on. I'm not going to get into all of that. I want to take it back to the mission communities. As those missions were secularized and incorporated into what would become San Antonio, all of these mission communities were still there, and they would continue to be there. In fact, here's a Tejano family at what I believe is to be Mission Espada around 1880. I've never seen this photograph anywhere else, so this is another one of my archival finds. And as you can see in the background is their traditional jacal, which is the traditional Coahuiltecan home, right? And so, I mean, this is 1880. This is decades after secularization. We still see Indian families. I mean, of course, physical features are not necessarily an indication, but look at them, right? I see some Indios in front of their jacal at the most basic level. And so by this time, the Anglos start coming in and taking political control, and they don't know what to make of us, so they start sorting out who's Indian and who's Mexican, and they label these, and so people like, for example, the Comanche, right, who in the 1880s still maintained these huge swaths of land through military control. They had rifles, they had guns. They were like the fiercest warriors on the southern plains. they become marked as enemies of the state by the US government, who's now in charge of Texas. And so they're hunted as enemies of the state by the US Army. And eventually they're removed to Oklahoma. Other people like the Lipan Apache, some of them would flee south to Mexico. Some of them were also removed to Oklahoma. But largely what happened in the case of the San Antonio Mission Indians, because of their acculturation into Spanish society, the US government said, oh, we're just going to call them Mexicans. We don't, you know. So they were largely spared from being hunted by the US Army. They were largely spared from removal. And they were just living as ethnic Mexicans or Tejanos, right, by the time the Anglos take political control. And they continue to live in these mission communities. Here's Mission Espada Classroom, 1941. And so here's one of the tribal elders that I've conducted many oral histories with the tribal members of the Tapilam. Raymond Hernandez is one of them. So what sparked this sort of resurgence that we begin to see in the 1960s and the 1970s? So for the mission descendant communities, they knew their history, but they became sort of invisible, right, to the rest of, maybe even to the rest of San Antonio, and certainly to the rest of the outside world. Well, what happened in the late 1960s were that this archaeologist, her name is Margaret Schutz, she's still alive, believe it or not, and she's like 90, I want to say 94 years old. I've had the opportunity, the honor of speaking with her a few times by phone. In fact, I was going to go interview her right before COVID hit. I had my plane ticket booked to California, where she lives now. And then COVID hit and I had to cancel the trip. You know, she's an elder. I didn't want to put her in that jeopardy. But she spearheaded these excavations in the late 1960s. This work was commissioned by the Archdiocese. They wanted to do some renovations at the mission at San Juan Capistrano. So, you know, they get their approvals from the state, and this archaeologist, Margaret Schutz, starts digging up all of these remains. And so what was customary was to bury the mission residents right on the mission grounds. That whole plaza that you see there, the entirety of that plaza was an Indian cemetery, you know? And so because they were baptized and they were mission residents, they were sort of entitled to those Catholic burials. And then of course, surrounding this whole complex was these huge stone walls, defensive walls, and those that were not baptized were buried on the outside of those walls. So as she's digging up these remains, and I know it's a lot of information, but I'm just trying to tell as much of the main story here that I can. As she's digging up these remains, people from the community start coming up to her, and this is 1968. This photo says 71, but the digs began in 68. And they said, what the hell are you doing? You're digging up our ancestral remains. Who are you? What are you doing? What do you want here? And then she writes in her official archaeology report that they claim descendancy from those mission Indians that she's digging up. And so this sort of began, mind you, to put all of this in a larger context. It's in the height of the Chicano movement. It's in the height of the American Indian movement, the Red Power movement, and all of these anti-globalization, third world liberation movements that are, you know, going on across the world. And so this community, because of these digs, they become visible again in defense of their ancestral remains, and it sparks what archaeologist Alston Toms has labeled a visible Coahuiltecan resurgence. And so for decades, they would struggle. There's the Chicano and Red Power movements. One footnote is that this was a time before NAGPRA, and NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And Indian remains were basically treated as objects rather than the ancestral remains of living human beings. So I think it was 1990, because of Indian activism, that NAGPRA was passed as a federal law. And so what you see here, you see two tribal consultants consulting with some archaeologists, I guess. I don't have the exact caption, but this is sort of to show what the spirit of NAGPRA now entails, and it entails consultation with federally recognized tribes if you're going to start doing archaeological work. But those digs were pre-NAGPRA, and so the remains ended up as objects of study, and they were shifted around in boxes from museum to university throughout Texas for 30 years. So these descendants come together, and you can see here on the left, 1986 article, 250-year-old bones of Indian buried in Mission Chapel. So that was like their first little victory, was in 1986. And it's because of their activism that they were able to get some little bit of remains back. But then in 1999, they were able to get almost all of the remains back, which represent the remains of about 125 people. And so they conducted a reburial ceremony on the grounds of Mission San Juan Capistrano. And I think I have that one. Look, so here's a newspaper article from that one. So here's the Tapilam. This was 1999, conducting a major reburial ceremony after decades of activism to get those remains from San Juan back. And here on the left, you can see the tribal community, Tapilam Coahuiltecan Nation, and on the right is a reburial marker where they reburied those ancestral remains in 1999. So that sort of brings us to the most contemporary struggle, and that's at the Alamo. And so the same thing, the Alamo was one of these 5 colonial missions. And long story short, there's a major renovation project that's been in the works for several years now. As they broke ground in, I think it was 2019, they came across human remains. The Tapilam was telling them all along, this is an Indian cemetery. The archival record tells us that about 1,300 people were buried, not just underneath the church, but what's now the entirety of Alamo Plaza. And I've seen those archival records, and they are extensive. You're talking about, close to 1,300 people, and detail, just like some of the records that I showed you before. And so I think I'll close this here. And then, so that's where we are right now. They filed a federal lawsuit. The Tapilam filed a federal lawsuit against the Alamo Trust Incorporated, the Texas General Land Office, and the city of San Antonio, basically arguing that they were left off of the human remains protocol. They were not included in the human remains protocol, even though, and I would argue it's not in their lawsuit, but I would add, even though there have been several NAGPRA studies that recommends consultation with the Tapilam because they are lineal descendants of the San Antonio missions. The weird thing is that, interestingly enough, NAGPRA is not at play here because it's not on federal or tribal lands, and the project is not receiving federal money. So basically, the Alamo Trust Incorporated, the people that maintain the Alamo now, they're free to, and they did basically come up with their own human remains protocol. But here's the good part. So that's sort of been settled just very recently. Long story short, the Tapilam Coahuiltecan Nation, they're building a brand new museum at the Alamo, and you're talking about like the state, I've seen the plans, state-of-the-art museum that's going to include the story of the Mission Indians. And there's tribal members that are sitting on that museum committee to inform the museum planners. And then they recently asked me, the tribe recently asked me to sit on that committee as well. So I was pretty honored and excited about that, as that work goes forward, to be able to tell those stories of the indigenous people of San Antonio at the Alamo.
Sure.
Wow.
And
Yeah, they would, I don't know if how much research you've done, but I know that they would take Native people to the Caribbean as slaves.
yes,
That's a whole nother untold story, really.
that's a whole other story. And but it surfaced in my life and in my experience. And so had I known this growing up as a child, I think it would have been transformative, right? It took a lot of digging. It took a lot of resisting the dominant narrative, a
Yeah,
lot of being called radical in a very bad way, because we're
yeah,
pushing up against that white supremacy, and all that colonialism that now is like so deeply embedded that it's even lateral violence that we're up against. It's not just, the oppressor, the colonizer. But what if there was one piece of advice for that you could offer to a youth from this area on why it's important to not only like dig into your roots, but affirm your indigenous heritage, like what would you say?
yeah, that's a good question. And I think you framed it well, right? Especially considering these attacks. So it's a really exciting time for us, for those of us that are in ethnic studies and indigenous history and those kinds of fields, because we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of academic departments that people fought for. My parents' generation, in the 1960s. So, for example, here at the University of Minnesota, I believe it was the first, if not one of the first, American Indian Studies departments, and we celebrated that 50th anniversary just a few years ago. Last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Chicano Studies Department here at the University of Minnesota. And so these are being played out across the nation, right? Basically, that period between 1968 and 71. So the 50th anniversary is 2018 to 2021, right around there. And so what we're seeing now is what we saw back then, is that white backlash. And that white backlash can be very corrosive. It's intended to claw in and to not let go. They're clinging on to the last vestiges of white supremacy. And that old saying, knowledge is power. It really is. It really is. And when you start to understand who you are and where you came from and to do the work, and that's what I was going to get back to. Some people really don't even know where to start. And I always say, start with your oldest living relatives and sit down with them and turn on your phone. These phones, their microphones are really good. Not only that, then you have a digital record, you can upload that, you can spit out a transcript. So sit down with your oldest living relatives and get their oral histories. And that's a good starting point. And then work your way from there to to maybe your parents, or your grandparents, or however it goes down the list. And then you can really start getting into that archival record and genealogy and connecting the dots. One of the most craziest tools that's out there is free. It's Family Search, and it's administered by the Mormon Church, who have the most extensive genealogical records. It has something to do with their religion, something about getting into heaven or something, but they literally go all over the world. They go into the archives, they scan digital records, and then they upload them to their system. So if you can go create your, it's called Family Search, create your free account, and it'll start linking your family tree as you plug in information. And as it does that, it pops up all these archival documents, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, newspaper clippings. It's just crazy stuff. And so, now more than ever, with these renewed attacks on ethnic studies and really just what's basic historical fact, basic historical record that they don't want us to teach. That was honestly one reason why I had to get out of K-12. You know, I just couldn't take those constraints anymore. So that's what I would recommend to young people. Go talk to your elders, sit down with them, record it. Yeah.
Yeah, document, digitize, disseminate. Those are the 3Ds of digital resistance.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's so important because we represent this digital generation. Like, we have such privilege. We can go backwards to do the work like you're doing, like literally dealing with paper thin, like brittle records, digitize it and leave that footprint for the other generation, so that all that work to bridge those gaps is done. It's so important. Wow.
I think sort of a rough estimate of, let's say, and then you know, engaging in things like this was, I hope, you know, I hope it gets out there for people to see. It's good to reconnect with you, Edith. We go back so long, and we each took our own journey, and then we're coming back, and then we have to start reconnecting with people like this that are doing the similar work too, right? So thank you again for the opportunity.
Well, thank you as well for reconnecting, for staying on the path, right? Because I feel like it was a generation of us that were mechistas, that got into ceremony, and we're still here. We're still doing the work, but it's almost like going back to even retake our oral storytelling millenary tradition, just to have these conversations with each other, to talk about what it means to be in this skin now and do that work, or to remember what it was not to know, and what we do with the information that we do know now, how it's useful for the present and for building and working towards a more just future for everybody. So thank you so much for your time. Always an open invitation if you want to talk. The space that I'm curating is not for any kind of monetization. This is purely información para la gente. Folks that are just, a lot of folks don't have connections to elders, or don't have connections to their peoples. And so they Google search things like, what does it mean to be Coahuiltecan? Or what does it mean to be Indian from San Antonio, or Indian from Texas, or whatever the query is. Folks are looking online. So the more digital footprints that we leave on the internet, the more chance we have with connecting with those people, and all getting in that same space to rebuild all those layers of disconnect that we've been born into.
And that's good. That's good to hear that, because, you know, sometimes, you know, I wonder, what is all this for? It's not easy, right? Like, these spaces that I'm in academia, they're not built for us. In fact, they were built to exclude us. And so the ways that I've had to fight to be in these spaces and to be taken seriously, you know, I've prayed a lot just to get to this point. And then I think about, well, I hope somebody's out there getting something from it. And, you know, even if it sparks that much of a conversation, then it's all worth it, you know? So
that's right. And probably one last thing I'll add is that, like right now I'm doing a lot of work around environmental justice, and working in an Indigenous circle has brought up so much for me as someone from Texas. I've had to really dig deep and get into my own questions of identity, culture, and the remnants, bringing out the remnants of those stories that have survived in my lineage. And one of the places that I reach, or that I get to, is that for me, like, Chicano was a bridge. Now I know my name, and my kids know their names. We know where we come from, and it's a different conversation. And so where we're at now is like, okay, we have our names, so we're trying to dig into the culture to get that language, because that language ties into a whole worldview and a life way of being with nature that at this particular moment is absolutely critical. Even though we have a lot of memories and lifeways erased, some of them still live. And a lot of the ways that we work with plants or that we engage with nature are things that can help restore balance in this modern imbalanced world that we live in, that is deeply needing that to step behind the indigenous leadership to guide them to restore that millenary conversation that we used to have as human beings in this beautiful natural world.
Yeah.
So this is like steps to something bigger. And so it's so critical, and I so appreciate the work that you're doing for all the generations, because you're bridging gaps that I'm so proud of you. Just thank you so much for showing up to do that work.
Thank you, and thank you for having me again. I look forward to how you put this out there, and maybe we'll have another conversation another time. Okay,
Thanks
sister.
for everything. We'll follow up.
All right, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.